All right, give me just a second. So, I wanted to do this video for a while now. Um, Basically, when the Acolyte came out, when it started, the from day one, like I knew what they were going to do with this show. When they announced it, and we saw like the picture of the bloody lightsaber, or whatever, and then read the initial interviews, I knew they were going to do something with this show to make the Jedi look bad. And what they were going to do was use a technique called dialectical inversion. And that's a big word way of saying an old trope that we've seen before. And it's the we're not so different, you and I trope that villains give to heroes a lot. Like Joker did in Dark Knight. That's probably the most famous one. And we'll go back to that example. But, and how you know they did this and they did it intentionally is because all the defense of this show comes down to that. When fans rightfully complained about the mistreatment of the Jedi in the show, the narrative kept coming out of, oh, but the Jedi are flawed. Or people were saying, oh, you're so dumb. The prequels, even George Lucas showed the Jedi are flawed. Da, 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 da. It's always the Jedi are flawed, or the Jedi are baby kidnappers, or all this kind of stuff. And that's all stupid. And I'll get down to that. Um, Dialectical inversion is an idea that of equating two things that should not be equated, and then inverting the moral and or authoritarian differences between the two. And it's done a lot in politics. It's done mostly in politics, usually done in progressive leftist politics. But you see an example of this in a slower way in George Orwell's Animal Farm, kind of with Snowball and Napoleon, where they start out both as pigs, trying to lead the animals, and the animals prefer Snowball. And slowly, very much like Palpatine does in the prequels, Napoleon convinces everyone to turn on Snowball, and when they won't, he drives Snowball out with force, and then he creates a narrative of how bad Snowball is, so that they went from being equals, and Snowball was actually appreciated more, than they went to equals, and then Napoleon surpasses him. So here's a quick example of it with these like Switch controllers. Here's an example of dialectical inversion. Is if I say I like red, and you say you like blue. And I say, okay, well, they're both colors. So we can agree on that. You say yes. And then I could use several narratives to say, well, red is the color of blood. Red is the color of passion and love. It serves a greater purpose than blue. Blue, is like the sky, or blue is sad. Red is fiery. Red is passion. Red is love. What I'm trying to do is convince you that red is better. So I want to change your view of blue that you prefer here to equal to red is better. That's a quick, probably non-academic description of dialectical example of dialectical inversion. But what we see with the Jedi and the Acolyte and this argument is you get the Jedi and the Sith. The Jedi are the good guys. George Lucas himself has been on record in numerous interviews saying the Jedi are the good guys. That the light side is good and the dark side is bad. Well, then people will take this. So Jedi are up here, and sorry, I get my camera. Jedi are up here, Sith are down here. Jedi good, Sith bad. So what the Acolyte tries to do, and what the argument always is, of defenders of it and people of the new sequel trilogy I've done even before the Acolyte, is say, well, the Jedi are flawed. So what they want to do is bring the Jedi down. And they won't say the Sith are flawed, because it's implied they are, because they're the bad guys. But it's a lie of omission. It's to say the Jedi are flawed. And what that's is supposed to do from this narrative is equate the two. Okay, well, they're both flawed. The next step is then to beat down how hypocritical the Jedi are, and that hypocrisy is bad. So now the Jedi are down here because the Sith aren't hypocritical. And there's some problems with that. Like, one thing, the Jedi are not hypocritical. And the way usually that people use hypocrite is to describe someone who meets 4 out of 5 good tenets of what they believe, and either dropped the ball on one, or hasn't quite gotten to one, or did actually meet all 5, but someone didn't like how they did it, or they just are in bad faith. So what they do is instead say, well, it's better to be, at least I'm not a hypocrite. And that's basically what the argument comes down to between the Jedi and the Sith, and this dialectical inversion, and the fans of the Acolyte and the fans of the sequel trilogy do this, like the same argument over and over and over and over again. But there's several things wrong with that. The Sith are evil, and that's where the conversation should end. And if someone brings this stupid argument to you, you say, no, the Sith are evil. The Sith kill people, and they like to do it, and they want to enslave the universe. They crave about power for their own sake. The Jedi train their entire life to be selfless and to die for other people, and people can leave the Jedi Order anytime they want. Once you try on the back foot of trying to defend against hypocrisy or flaws, you've lost. Like, this is how the dialectic works. It's like if someone accuses you of sexism or racism and you're not, and then, or someone says you're stupid and you're not, and then you say, well, I'm not that. Well, now you're engaging on their terms, and now you're on the back foot, and you're not going to win. The point of a dialectic, especially dialectical inversion, is, from the philosophical sense, a dialectic is to synthesize. You've heard that. I'm sure people have heard that term before: thesis, antithesis, synthesis. But in practical terms, what it is to get you to compromise. And we see this as a great example in The Dark Knight, with you have the Joker on one side and you have Batman on the other side. In the entire movie, the Joker is trying to get Batman to see things his way. He is trying to get Batman to enter the dialectic with him so he can invert it. So it won't be that they're the same, it's that the Joker is right. And we know that is true because of the character Two-Face. And this is actually what is brilliant about Two-Face in this film, and why he's needed in this film as a villain and as a hero, is that he is split down the middle. He is the dialectic personified. More so, he is dialectical inversion personified, because he goes from Harvey Dent, good guy on the side of the law, to Two-Face, or wounded Harvey Dent. He's got both of the faces, and he gets a visit from the Joker, and then he becomes Two-Face completely. So you've got the good and the bad, but the bad side's always winning. He compromised. And because he compromised, he is no longer good. You can't have the duality like that. It's something that corrupts. You can't give in and enter into that dialectic. And that's what Harvey tries to do. That's why he says it's not fair. And that's his equalizer. That's his way of bringing good down and bringing evil up, is to use fair as the ultimate good. And if good doesn't equal fair, then it's not good. And that's why he gives in the chance at the end, and he won't believe in a good morality. And when Batman saves the Joker, that's what the Joker goes, "You are incorruptible." And he realizes that he can't bring Joker down. And that's why he actually said that to Batman. I took Harvey Dent and I brought him down to our level. And there's a lot more to say. It's a loaded sentence. But long story short, let me get back to this. The Jedi failed in the prequel trilogy. That doesn't mean they were hypocritical, and it doesn't even mean they were flawed. It means they were overpowered. Like, failure is not a flaw. Failure is not hypocrisy. They were overpowered by the greatest Sith Lord that ever existed, and it may have even actually been the will of the Force, which the Force is not portrayed, as far as I can tell, in the Star Wars universe. It's not God. It's not an ultimate good. It has a will of its own, and it also has a dark will of its own. And whether or not Anakin was supposed to kill off the Jedi or the Sith, who knows? But that's a question they themselves even answer. But it should go to show you how powerful and in good that the Jedi are, that they would even go against that itself to try to save the lives of millions of people at the cost of their own. So no, the Jedi are not the bad guys, and I wouldn't even argue that they're flawed. It's a very hard argument because people try to bring that up, that oh, they should have let Anakin and Padme be together. It's like, well, they did. Anakin could leave at any time. It was Anakin that failed. Anakin was flawed. He would not let go of his fear, and he would not let go of his power as a Jedi. He wouldn't give it up and go be with his wife. You know, he wanted both things at the same time, and he allowed that to corrupt him. Um, the ultimate thing with this, and again, I'll say it again, it's never it's always a deception. It's always a lie when people do this, especially with this show and Disney Star Wars. It's always to bring the Jedi down and raise the Sith up. And they may not even realize that's what they're doing, but it's always that. It's always an attack on the Jedi. It's always an excuse for the Sith. The Sith aren't even mentioned. Like they're not even. It's like they're just expected to be there. And what's funny is Solzhenitsyn actually had a quote about this from the Soviet Union in the Gulag Archipelago, where he was talking about how terrible things had gotten, where he's like, if a thief tried to rob you with a knife and you stabbed him with your knife, you were the one that was prosecuted because it was expected that a thief would have a knife. You were the terrorist. I mean, you want to talk about dialectical inversion? That's what communism is, and that's what the USSR, Soviet Union was. But what I say all that to say that, and I'm not trying to be mean, but I don't know how you could be an actual fan of the sequel trilogy and an actual fan of the Acolyte. I'm not saying somebody who just watched it and kind of enjoyed it because they liked parts of it that with lightsabers or whatever, but actually bought into the ideology and have a standard. And I think that's what it is. I think these people do not want a standard. I don't think they want a moral standard to have to live up to, because that's what the Jedi are. And any time I see people attacking the Jedi and saying how much they failed Anakin, or because they didn't, or how flawed they are, when you push a little bit back, the argument usually comes down to, oh, they don't really want, they hold the Jedi to an obscene standard that the Jedi meet, but it's a made up standard this person made up, but they don't really want standards. And you know they don't want standards because they don't hold the villains up to that same standard. Again, it's just kind of expected that the Sith just exist. And in the Star Wars universe, the Sith are basically like this chaotic force of entropy that just destroys everything. Like it's always there. And the Jedi are only thing standing in the way, and they're doing it selflessly. They're sacrificing all attachments and all personal gain to save the defenseless, you know? So I think that's what it comes down to, is that people who agree with the ideology of the Acolyte, they don't want a standard. Oh, and the other thing is, another reason it failed is because people don't want that idea. And one reason we know that is because the Acolyte is a Lilith story. And if you're not familiar with Lilith, it's an old uh, Jewish kind of, and I guess early Christian mystic. They all kind of adopted it too. Story that Adam had multiple wives from Adam and Eve, but Lilith was the first wife, and she didn't want to be ruled by Adam, so she kind of partnered with the snake slash Satan and got power that way. And that's what this story is. One of the twins, the quote unquote good one, becomes the bad one at the end, and that's eh, the allure of power and even maybe seduction, physical seduction from the stranger. And that's what he's kind of like the serpent in the garden, and she's kind of like Lilith. And people knew this story for 5,000-6,000 years. It's been in the human psyche for that long, for a lot of civilization. But we know it as a warning story. And like another one you see that in is The Witch, by, I forget the director, but it's the horror movie that came out a few years ago. It's a wonderful movie, but it works because it's a horror story where the girl accepts Black Phillip's offer, and she becomes a witch, and it's a tragedy and it's horrible. Like he just murdered her family and tricked her into what he calls power and living deliciously, and she's a slave now. And that's what this story is. Like the good twin, the bad twin. I get their names confused. I think it was Osha that became the bad one at the end. I didn't care to remember. She is now a slave to the dark side. And this is wrapped up and presented as like a feminist kind of empowerment thing, but that's how a lot of feminist empowerment stories are, is they basically are a Lilith story. It's a woman, and it's the witch story. It's the old not just the movie, but witches from the medieval period. That was the whole thing, is like a witch was a woman who made a deal with the devil for power, usually to usurp her husband or just male authority in general. And we know this story, and people know that it's a warning, and they know it like isn't great for society, and it's not great for men or women. And I think that's a major reason why this show failed, is because the scent of this was on it. The scent of the inversion and destruction and mockery of the Jedi and the Lilith side of it were predictable from the start. Um, I think people are smarter than we give them credit for, and I think if I was able to pick up on this before the show even came out, that a lot of people were, and even those of us who gave it a chance, I mean, you just saw it from basically day one where the show was going to go, and that's what the metrics seem to show, is that people watched the first episode or two or three and then dropped off, and I don't blame them. It was a technical failure, I believe. The acting for some of the actors was great. Acting for a lot of it was not great, but we know these patterns in these stories, and people can recognize when good is being mocked and when good is being destroyed, and people are tired of that. People have to live in our current world as it is, and it's one thing to present tragedy, like like a Shakespearean tragedy. It's another thing to present the mockery and deconstruction of goodness. And I think people just aren't here for it. So that's why I believe The Acolyte failed from an artistic and psychological and sociological side of things. I think the people just rejected it, because I know I did. Anyway, we'd like to talk more about this kind of stuff. Josh and I would. We might get our friend Colin, Hans, or some other YouTubers on here and tell us what you think. Leave a comment, and I'll catch you guys later.